Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday from 9 to 10 o'clock. We talk about some of the things that might affect you in your life, some of the issues that happen internationally, nationally, locally, some of the things that may affect what takes place and what happens here in little old Stewart and in Martin County. So it's kind of a community participation show. You can join in if you'd like. We ask that you keep it civil, but 220-9788, 220-WSTU is the number if you want to call. We're, I always say we're not political, but we actually kind of somewhat are, because most economic issues and financial issues end up being somewhat political because everybody argues about money. So it isn't, but it isn't intended to be purely political. It's intended to be more of an economic analysis of what's going to happen. Because the good thing about economics, particularly in a capitalistic system, is that in general you're going to get a certain result, whether you politically believe in that result or not. And so it's one of those kind of things that it's always good, because if you know what's going to happen, you can at least prepare for it. It may not be what you like, but you should prepare for it, because it is a system that we live by here in the United States. It's not necessarily the case internationally, but it is the way we function here in the U.S. with a capitalistic system. In effect, economically, the people speak with their dollars. They vote every time that they buy something, every time that they do something, that they take an action. And in general, people will take actions based on that financial benefit or that financial expense, and they will make that choice whether or not we like it, whether we like it or not. And it is one of those kind of things which it always amazes me, because you may not understand fully why they're making that choice unless you really look at the numbers. And economics, I've always been amazed. Economics is different than accounting. I'm a financial person. I've dealt in accounting and finance all my life, but and a lot of times accounting profits, for example, are different than economic profits, and it's a different thing. I know a lot of accountants, a lot of CPAs that they hate economics because it's not as cut and dry even as their accounting. In accounting, it is what it is, and you're just recording the result of it. In economics, economic profit might not always show up in the form of cash, or something that you can readily see up front. So it's more difficult to account for economic profits and what is a normal economic profit versus an excess economic profit. And the other thing that I think, and I mentioned this, in the U.S., people talk with their dollars a lot of times, and in fact, a lot of times do just the opposite of what they espouse with their mouth. We saw that recently. We're seeing that with Amazon. Amazon took a bunch of workers and took them from full time to part time. Presumably so that it would provide better service to the customer. That may be, but the economic byproduct of that was that it saved them millions of dollars in health insurance costs. Now, is Amazon as a corporation supposed to do what's socially right and continue to pay those people, and actually, the owner, the primary owner, not the owner, because the owner of Amazon is still largely the public. It's a publicly traded company. The control may be in a very small group, a small block of stock that's worth a lot of money. But the fact of the matter is that there are a number of shareholders, publicly traded shareholders, who are the actual owners, and that's one of the things. Before we get a little further into it, that I want to make sure people understand. I had this discussion with somebody the other day. Oh, these big corporations, the big corporation is you. It's mom and pop. If you have a retirement account, an IRA account, if you have a 401k account, if you're retired from the school system, retired from the state government, retired from any of these places, you are the owner of those big corporations. They do that because you tell them to do it. And you say, well, I don't do that. Yes, you do. There's a proxy that comes out all the time. Now, the mutual fund that owns your units is doing the proxy. So they're controlling what they want, and they want the highest financial return as possible, because if they don't provide it, you as an investor, you're maybe not you because you don't control it, but your retirement account that somebody controls, the administrator of your 401k plan or whatever, depending upon your pension plan or whatever, they control it. And they're going to do whatever's best, because their job in the capitalistic system is to produce as high a return as possible, so that when you retire, you will have money to retire. That's their goal. Their goal is not to be socially responsible so that you have to live off the government when you're retired. Their job is to make sure you have enough income so that you don't have to live off the government when you retire. And those might be conflicting goals. But in a capitalistic system where there is a free market, and that's the other thing we always talk about. And in a lot of areas, we don't have free markets. We have monopolies or oligopolies. We don't have free market. And if you don't have a free market, which is basically equal buyers and sellers. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily equal number, but at least equal power on both sides. You could have a free market with a huge buyer on one side and a huge seller on the other, as long as both that buyer and that seller have the ability to negotiate equally, and can and have equal standing in the negotiation, because you will negotiate a fair price. But normally, a free market requires a large number of buyers and a large number of sellers, each with no significant power over the other. So they negotiate. It becomes a negotiated process. I mean, that's really what it's about. It's about negotiating among a bunch of people what they're willing to pay and what they're willing to sell for. So it's important to understand that, first of all, when you're talking about some of these things that are happening at the corporate level, like the Amazon situation, he has an obligation to as a CEO, regardless of being a majority owner, he has an obligation to act in the best interest of his shareholders, and his shareholders in general. And so, and that generally means providing a return that's appropriate for the amount of risk that's involved. And he has, because otherwise the investor is going to go somewhere else, and he'll be out of business. So, and that means that a bunch of people lose money. And if they lose money, it affects our retirement system. It affects everything else. So, any CEO has an obligation not to act upon their own beliefs and their own social responsibilities. They have an obligation to act on behalf of their shareholders. That's just the way it works. It will always be the way it works. They can say whatever they want, but the fact of the matter is that if they don't do what they're required to do by the SEC and by others, they will be arrested or unemployed. Either way, they won't have an influence on that company any longer, and the company will make an adjustment and do what they need to do. So it's important to understand that economically, that's different than politically. It's like Buffett. Warren Buffett talks about a lot of things, about the tax system being unfair, that his secretary pays more in taxes than, now that's garbage on a percentage basis, maybe, pays more in taxes than he does, and all that kind of stuff. But you don't see him voluntarily stepping up and paying more. You don't see him not taking advantage of those tax benefits. In fact, he built part of his company on the insurance industry, and in fact, taking over insurance companies that were being buried by certain types of claims that he could get them out of. So why did he do that? Because he has an obligation to his shareholders. He has an obligation to his shareholders. He may personally not believe that he shouldn't have done that, but his company had an obligation to go in there. It was an opportunity to buy and make money, and he took that opportunity. So if he hadn't, some other competitor would, and he wouldn't be part of the Dow right now. He would probably be, a small private company doing something else. So it's important to keep that in mind. It doesn't really make any difference what a CEO says, unless that CEO is the majority owner. And I'm talking about 51%. And even if they are a majority owner, they still have an obligation. They still have a duty of care to those other entities. Those other 49%. That's always the responsibility that they have. They have the responsibility to take care of the other minority shareholders. That's as when you become a publicly traded company, that's the responsibility you have. So it's not the responsibility to to you personally or what you think. You have an obligation to take care of those that don't have the power in the corporation. And if you act upon your own interests and not the interests of the minority shareholders in a publicly traded corporation, you will find yourself slapped with a minority shareholder lawsuit. And there have been a number of them in Delaware, and there's big money for that, including even selling the company. Even you think, well, you have 51%, you sell the company, you have a right to sell it for what you want. No, you got to make sure that the other 49% got taken care of the way they were supposed to be, that it was a fair price, that there wasn't some quid pro quo that was behind the scenes that the majority shareholder got, that took advantage of the minority shareholder. In fact, like I said, because many corporations are chartered in Delaware, there are a number of shareholder lawsuits relative to the value of a company. Companies that have been sold, public companies that have been sold to other public companies with scrutiny by boards and everything else, but attorneys are suing those companies, claiming that the value that they received was not fair market value, and thus the minority shareholders didn't receive fair market value. So, so that company's got to go out and defend that. They've got to get an appraisal to show that they did get fair market value and all those kind of things. So keep in mind that right now, the publicly traded companies are very heavily regulated. And regardless of how they feel about things, the CEO of Mobil or BP may truly believe we've got some sort of a global warming problem that the U.S. is participating in, and would like to reduce carbon footprint. They can work on that by trying to to convert some more of their profit stream to solar or to wind or something that might be more or nuclear power. But they have an obligation to their shareholders to still continue to make as much money as possible. So if it costs more and they make less on solar than natural gas, they have an obligation to their shareholders to sell natural gas. That's their responsibility. And if you don't like it, then you need to tell your retirement account or your pension administrator, I don't want it. Sell that stock. Well, first of all, they're not going to do that normally. And they're not going to affect the rest of the people in that pension plan by doing that. If you're just one of 1,000 or 10,000 or 15,000, there are now where you have control, like in your IRA, where you can control what you invest in, or in your 401k, when you can control what you invest in your 401k. There are opportunities for what they call social funds. And you can look into those social funds will invest. If you have a problem with certain research practices in the cosmetic industry, or You have problems with oil companies, um, or if you want to skew your investments towards uh, solar funds or other things that are more environmentally conscious, then you have the ability to do that. There's housing funds in there, things like that provide low income housing. You have the ability to search those out. And as long as you're willing to accept a lower return, because most of them, because they're limited in terms of what they can invest in, they don't invest for profit, they invest for social reasons. That means that if that company is not making a profit, uh, you're still going to invest in it. And you could have invested in this other company that is making a profit. So you're giving up a return. So as long as you're aware of that from a retirement account, now some of those accounts have done very well. And, but some of them have not. So it's just important to be able to understand what you're doing, because what you may end up doing is ending up not being able to retire when you want to, or with the dollars that you want to, or you may be dependent upon the government to subsidize you when you're retired, something that a lot of people don't want. But so it's all conflicting, but economically, that's the fact. If you choose to limit what your investment advisor can invest in based on non-economic factors, you're most likely, and in general, are going to produce a lower return. You may, in some cases, come close to providing a equal return, but most likely not, because a lot of those entities right now are in markets that are not profitable relative to their costs. For example, wind and solar are now just starting to get to the point that they even are economically viable, that the costs of producing it is less than the cost, the price that they sell it for. Some of that were loss leaders. They were being generated to try to develop the industry. And then, of course, once the subsidies drop off, they no longer make sense. They lose money. So that's the other thing. Some of those industries are being subsidized right now, and they might not necessarily be subsidized in the future. So anyway, I just, we're kind of getting a little bit off, but I want to kind of understand people to, kind of see how this works, because we hear all of this stuff. We hear the rhetoric, and they can actually believe that. But they have an obligation to to produce profits for their shareholders. And when they get to the point that they're a monopoly or an oligopoly, then the government needs to step in. They have to step in and do something. Years ago, they broke up AT&T. And what happened with that? Well, initially they all got back together and but we now have more competitors, stronger competitors. There's different industries that let's think about it a minute. That's the other thing. When AT&T was one entity and they controlled everything relative to telephones, what incentive did they have to get into the cellular world? They already controlled all the phones. They had no incentive other than protect their profits. That's the only reason they would get into that, is to protect their profits. Now, as individual companies, when they split up, those individual companies had all kinds of incentive because it gave them diversification. They didn't own the infrastructure. They only owned the service portion of the businesses. And so at that point, they had to find a way to get out of the infrastructure costs that they were paying AT&T and to diversify so that they had other sources of revenue in case, who knew? Nobody thought that the world would ever go to a point where you didn't have a landline. That's just a given, right? When you build a house, it has to have stuff for telephone. Not anymore, not anymore. But had AT&T not been broken up, you'd still do that. That'd still be where we were in most cases, because they would have suppressed that technology. How? By not offering the competition and by not being forced to provide an alternative to them to build their networks. So, it is what happens. But as they get to be a certain size, you have to control that, because at that point they have the ability to affect price and service without it being fair. And that is really what, a capitalistic system is about. It seems cruel, and if left to its own devices, it can be cruel. If you take capitalism to the full version of laissez-faire, and you know uh, and the government doesn't step in when there's monopolies and oligopolies, and allows certain people to control completely a market, you're going to have a pretty bad situation. I mean, just look at any of the communist countries or socialist countries where they control all of the infrastructure. In those situations, you don't have good service and you don't have fair price. It You just don't have it, and that's why people are escaping those countries on a on a daily basis, is because they don't have that type of thing. In some of those countries, just the access to those services are prohibitive for most people. So they don't. Not everybody has cell service or a cell phone or texting or access to the internet or whatever. They just don't have it. So it's something to keep in mind, and that's where I was kind of getting to in a long roundabout way. Is internationally, it's I want to talk about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and and the reason I want to talk about it is because, and I want to talk about it not from a political standpoint, but from an economic standpoint. And here's the thing: uh, the problem that I have sometimes politically in the United States is that we have most of our population is so used to what we have here, and that's the right to free speech and the right to a lot of other things, but it's the right to choose, the right to have you know whatever you know a product we want, whatever service we want. We have choices. It may be cost prohibitive sometimes, but we have choices, and we have that in the U.S. And so a lot of times we think, and we have a government that makes sure that that continues, that somebody doesn't uh, get an unfair advantage. For example, that the CEO of Amazon doesn't get a bribe to keep somebody out of the business, keep somebody out of the from selling through Amazon, for example. So Procter and Gamble can't go to Amazon and give them a payment behind the scenes to their management, and their management all of a sudden stops stops allowing certain competitors of Procter Gamble or Johnson and Johnson or whatever to uh, to not sell their product on the through Amazon. Now, Amazon has the right to be selective, and Amazon is a really kind of a monopoly at this point in terms of what's happening. At least an oligopoly. There's very little competition left um, in certain areas of the industry. So they can right now, because they have that advantage, unless they're regulated, they can price so that they get the same result. They can price so that the small business can't afford them, and they can leave people out that way. They can restrict, because there's no competition. They can restrict access to certain entities, or make certain requirements that would keep certain small entities out. Um, like, for example, sales tax issues or whatever. Most small businesses can't afford to collect sales tax nationwide and handle all of that, and do it. So whereas a big corporation can. So you can in effect make it so that somebody can't sell just because they're too small to handle the administrative costs of being able to do that on the internet. So um, it's that kind of, it's frankly, it's similar. It's similar in other industries too. In the CPA industry right now, the IRS, because they can't control identity theft, they have not figured out how to control identity theft. They're pushing the cost of that back on the tax preparer. and to the tax preparer companies and others. So now all of a sudden, the small tax preparer is looking at being priced out of the market because they can't afford $5,000 or $8,000 and the infrastructure and the security systems and all the things that they have to have if they're going to prepare tax returns because the IRS says you have to do that. Coming up this next year, for a tax preparer to be able to get their preparer tax identification number, it's called a PTIN, for them to be able to renew that PTIN, which I have to be able to file a tax return. To do that, I have to sign a statement saying that I have implemented all of these security features, including dual authorization on access to the system and secure backup, encryption, all of those kind of things. I have to sign off on that, or I can't get my PTIN. So what's going to happen? Well, if I'm a small tax preparer that just prepares tax returns during uh, March and February, March and April, January, February, March and April, and I'm pretty cheap because I'm just doing some individual returns, small ones, and I'm doing a bunch of them. Um, I can't afford. I don't need the best and most expensive software. I'm doing basic returns. All I do is need something I can file electronically, and I can, even if it's kind of like a forms machine, which there are those out there. They're not great if you're doing but if you're doing very simple returns, it can be, W-2s and things like that. It can be very, very easy. Frankly, the IRS can do it for you almost, but so that's out there. So what's going to happen? Those people can't afford that kind of infrastructure because all of a sudden now that makes their cost similar to the cost of any of the large firms or firms like ours. And then at that point, they're not competitive because they don't have the experience and they don't have the people that we have. So, all of a sudden they're out of business, and it's going to put a lot of them out of business. Now, is that the intent? Probably, because they don't regulate a lot of those. The IRS doesn't regulate a lot of those preparers. So, I mean, they have no control over them other than the PTIN. So, and electronic filing. So, those kind of things, that increases the cost. Now, your cost of your tax return is going to go up by probably somewhere between 20 and 50% because all the competition is gone. And it costs me more anyway to do that. So I've got to charge what I'm charging. I'm not going to raise my prices necessarily, although I could, but my competition on the low end is going to have to raise their prices. And at that point, if if somebody can go in to a firm like ours that has professionals that have years and years of training and know what we're doing, as opposed to maybe somebody who does this work on the side during tax season and doesn't go to the training, isn't a CPA, isn't an enrolled agent, and they're doing all of this on the side just to make a few extra bucks. They may say, "Well, gee, I might be missing something," and a lot of times they are, but it doesn't. They're not missing anything big, so sometimes it doesn't make sense. Maybe in fact, sometimes they're missing something, and it's getting them more money back because their preparer is doing something wrong. Now they're open to an audit, but what's their chances of being audited? So what I'm saying is there's a lot of stuff going on out there that if you overregulate something, or if you don't regulate something that needs to be regulated, you're going to it's going to cost you money, and you're going to get a market that doesn't have a good price, doesn't have a fair price, because you've limited the competition, or you've increased the supply. That's the other thing. You could have, you could, if you allow a bunch of people into an industry that don't have to meet certain standards, don't have to do certain things, then all of a sudden, there's a bunch of people doing it, selling, and less people buying, and the price is going to go down because the buyers have control. So anyway, what I was getting at is that's kind of that's the way the corporations work, and internationally though, and so we assume that that's going to be that's the way the world works, regardless of where I go. So if I go to the Ukraine, for example, or China, the assumption is that I'm going to sit down with another business person and we're going to hammer out a fair price, and that fair price is going to be something we're going to agree to, and it's, we're equal buyers and equal sellers, and that's going to be that's how the price is going to be determined. That is not how the price is going to be determined in China. That's why I mentioned the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In China, in the Ukraine, you are going to go through a bureaucrat who you're going to have to bribe. So, and people are like, "Whoa, bribe!" Well, see, that's a problem for us, but that's a way of life in these foreign countries. They're controlled, particularly by in the ones I mentioned, by government people who do not allow certain things into the country unless they get a payment for it. And you say, "Oh, that's horrible. That's horrible." It is, and it's not the way the business should, but it is the way business takes place in a country that's controlled by the government, where the government controls price, and one person in that government is responsible for who gets those contracts. They get bribed. It is illegal under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for a U.S. entity to bribe a foreign person. That is illegal. It is not illegal in a lot of other places. So what did we just talk about? If I go to Ukraine or to China and I want to do business with them, and I am going to, I have a product that I want to sell into their country, and I want them to allow me to come in there to set up an operation to do that. If I have to pay, a couple people in that country, a few $1,000,000 to get that done, and I'm allowed to do that because I'm in a country that doesn't have a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So I go in there and I pay off those couple government employees a couple $1,000,000, but now I've got sole access to the country and I can charge a whole lot more, right? So for me, I'm going to be able to charge a higher price. Now, what's going to happen? A U.S. company is going to come in and they can't bribe that same person. Well, first of all, if I'm that person, I'm already not interested because I want to be rich. And my way of getting rich in that country is to get bribes, because at some point in time, I'm not going to be in power. And when I'm not, I have to have made my money. And that's how I make my money. That is my industry. That's what I do for a living, is I take bribes. And, I know there's people out there that just cringe at this thing saying, "That's not right. That's not right. We can't, you live in the U.S. It's not right in the U.S. It's illegal in the U.S. It is not illegal in Ukraine, and it's not illegal in China. I mean, it on face is, but it happens constantly. And it doesn't make any sense. That's why I used China, because China is a good example. They're a huge country. People think, well, they must be playing fairly. They're not. We've already talked about the fact that how they don't play fairly. For example, one of the ways that I can cheat is to be paid in a fake currency, a currency that doesn't represent the market. For example, if I go into Cuba and I get paid in the national cook, that's an arbitrary price. It's equal to the dollar. Actually, it's more valuable than the dollar. On the fair market, it's worth, probably 20% of the dollar, maybe not even that much. And that's the currency that trades within the country. So, if all of a sudden I'm getting paid in a currency that's worth more than the fair market value, as a country now, I'm getting an advantage on that. Why do you think that Cuba, as a communist country, regulates how trade takes place and in what currency the trade takes place? It's because they can control it and they make more money that way. Is there money are there things that happen behind the scenes where somebody's given $1 instead of a cook, especially a local cook, and which is illegal, by the way, in Cuba. You cannot you can trade in the cook, the national cook, but you cannot trade in the local currency. It's illegal for you to trade dollars for local currency. Why? Because it bypasses the profit system for the government. At that point, you're paying directly. You're getting the product cheaper because you're paying in equivalent dollars, in equivalent fair market value currency, instead of paying in a fake currency, an artificial price. That happens it happens in China. That's why China supports or doesn't support their currency, so that it affects how much profit they make. Because if they artificially regulate their currency so that it's worth more, they can, they can get an artificially high price if it's paid in renminbi, or they can get an artificially they can artificially lower their price competitively if they want to, by not supporting their currency. That gives them an unfair trade advantage, so that they're then selling their products. They're selling their products at a lower price. So um, it it's one of those kind of things where we basically are looking at how that works. The other way they do it is you can't remove the currency for the country. So let's say, for example, China. If I China controls what currency leaves the country. Here in the U.S., if you decide to buy something in Europe, you can wire funds out of the country. You can convert that those U.S. dollars to euros or whatever else you want to convert it to, and you can spend those dollars. And the government doesn't regulate how much of that you can do. They don't say to you, you can only do $100,000. You can only do $500,000 in the next 24 months. You can't do any more than that, or in your lifetime, or even have to prove it completely. That includes contracts. Let's say I'm doing business with a Chinese company, and that Chinese company says, I want to be paid in renminbi. All right, so I have to convert. I have to find renminbi. Technically, I have to buy that through. China. I have to officially translate my dollars into renminbi through the government in China. Now, there are a couple people, literally a couple people, who control in China that process, and they get paid a fee for that. It's 2 or 3%, but they get 2 or 3% of every financial transaction, whether it's dollar, euro, whatever, that comes through China. How many billions of dollars is that? So you wonder how these people get rich in a communist country? You're the one that's in charge of that. And you get to keep some of that because that's part of your compensation. So that's controlled. They say how much of that you can do, especially going the other way. Coming in, they don't have a problem with. But if I want to now take my renminbi and turn it into dollars and then pay myself back in dollars so I can convert it and spend it in the US, I can't do that. I cannot do that. There's limits on the amount of money that any person or company can take out of China. Any of their currency they can take out of China. So there's limitations on that. And that's, in effect, if I'm paid but I can't spend it except in China, think about that a minute. So that's what happens when there's no competition. There are artificially high prices. I've now paid something, regardless of what it turned out to be on paper. If I can't spend the dollars, if I can't spend my profits except in China on Chinese products, then I'm always going to be in a situation where that's not worth as much to me because I can't use the money unless I become completely dependent upon China for my income, in which case I'm now completely dependent upon a monopoly. And so, pretty much I'm never going to get fair price. I have to be, I have to understand that. There are major U.S. corporations that don't understand that have never figured out that doing business in China is not the same as doing business in the U.S. And they keep banging their head against the wall and wonder why they don't come out better, and it's because of that. And people are allowed to make profits from time to time in China, especially if it's good for the government. But they always control whether that happens or not, and it's with control. I know there is a huge market in the world right now. Now, is this a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? I don't think so, but I can tell you that it's going on, and I can tell you that it happens pretty consistently in one of our locations in the U.S. that's a bastion of socialistic control. But what happens is that, let's say I'm a Chinese national that has left the country, and I have the equivalent of $3 million sitting in a Chinese bank, right? That's in renminbi that I can't get out, and that they won't let me take out. So I can't spend it here in the U.S. I have no ability to spend it. Now, let's say I have a major U.S. company that comes to me and they want to do business in China. And as a result, they have to pay in renminbi, and they don't want to pay the government fee, and they don't want to pay the government price because that's not the fair market value of the renminbi, even though it's supposed to be. So what they do is they come to me and they say, "Look, I'll give you my bank account in the United States in exchange for your bank account in China." And so now that's how that person gets their money out. It never leaves the country, still has to be spent there. And that's how the U.S. company gets that done. That's illegal, I think. It's certainly illegal in China. So probably you're violating international trade agreements. But, what else do you do? I've seen people end up. So that's when you're doing business in those countries. You're constantly in a gray area or in a black area, where you're not supposed to be dealing in that. You're in the black market. That's why they call it that. So those are the kind of things that are happening. And in a lot of these places, we have black markets and gray markets, and that's the way it is. Internationally, that is how a U.S. company internationally is forced to operate. That is why some of those U.S. companies that primarily do business overseas and not in the U.S. have moved overseas. It's not strictly, it's not strictly trade agreements. That's some of it. It's not strictly support for, cheap labor and stuff. Some of it has to do with the fact that they just literally can't do business in many of the countries they're doing business with unless they're outside of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And that's a way of life, unless you're going to be out of business. I mean, that's your alternative, because you don't control the one on the other side of the transaction. If you want to do business with them, these are the terms. The terms are, we pay this price, which is probably higher than your competitor's going to get, but I get $2 million. That's the way it works. That's how it works in a system that's not actually controlled by the people, but controlled by the government. See, communism was designed to be controlled by the people. The government people that are implementing that are only doing that temporarily because the populace isn't capable of doing it. It's happened for an awful long time. You'd think the people in China would eventually get smart, but they don't have any choice. So I'm being a little sarcastic, but that's the way. And I'm using China as an example, but that works in a lot of places. In Russia, it's becoming a little more capitalistic because those government people actually are working through private Russian corporations that they have major interests in. So the bribes come through a corporation, not through, so that makes it looks a little cleaner. You can bribe them that way. But, and that's what happens. I remember years and years and years ago, there was a company that used to build boats for, I think it was for Honduras. So it was under the State Department because you can't build a military boat for another country unless the State Department has approved it. So it was all approved. It was going to Honduras's Navy. And so what happened is that, and then it would be fitted with guns once it got, once it got outside of um, typically the U.S. Interestingly enough, probably fitted with guns prior to the time that it passed Cuba. But anyway, and then they would take these boats down and deliver them. And there was a contract with the business and all of that kind of thing to be able to do that. Now, that went through the State Department. I doubt very seriously there were bribes involved in that because the State Department regulates that. So they're not going to pay the bribes. But I will tell you this, every single one of those boats that went down to Honduras were loaded with consumer items, cars, clothes, refrigerators, the whole bit, everything you can think of. Where were they going? They had been purchased by generals and admirals and all those kind of people in Honduras, and they were being shipped down to them so that they would avoid the excise taxes and all of the things that went with that. Just a little perk for being an admiral in the Honduras Navy. So, this has been going on for years. We just don't understand it. We don't realize that it takes place because we think everybody's like us. That's our problem. We think everybody's like us. So keep in mind when you hear some of the things that are going on, right now relative to Ukraine and all of that kind of stuff, pretty much that's typical practice. And when a government says they're going to clean up corruption, that's the kind of thing that they're supposedly going to clean up, is those bribes. I personally, and I guess President Trump as well, would question whether that's actually going to happen. Is that really going to happen, or is this just a new regime that's going to take advantage of those bribes? So we're going to clean up the old guys so that they don't get the bribes, but we're maybe going to still make sure the new guys get a bribe. So anyway, that's kind of how some of that stuff works. It's kind of interesting how it works, but anyway, it's kind of good to understand the economics of how international trade really works, because it's not going to change because it's not a free market in many places. So especially with communist or socialistic controlled countries where all of that is regulated by them. Anyway, I hope it was a little bit of an interesting discussion this morning, or comments this morning. Join us every Wednesday right here on WSTU. We talk about these issues. You're welcome to call 220-9788, 220-WSTU. We'd be happy to air some of those out, positively or negatively. But we appreciate you joining us right here on WSTU, Digital 1450. We are Martin County's Heritage Station.